This is part 4 of Federalist 69. We'll start with paragraph 7. There are some long paragraphs here. Please make sure you look at parts 1 and 2 of this Federalist for sure to kind of get a bigger picture of what we are going to cover. The President, okay, I'll start reading beginning of the paragraph 7. The President is to have power with advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. The King of Great Britain is the sole and absolute representative of the nation in all foreign transactions. He can, of his own accord, make treaties of peace, commerce, alliance, and all of every other description. It has been insinuated that his authority in this respect is not conclusive, and that his conventions with foreign powers are subject to revision and stand in need of the ratification of Parliament. But I believe this doctrine was never heard of until it was broached upon the present occasion. Every jurist of that kingdom, then he refers to William Blackstone, who was an authority on the laws of England, and every other man acquainted with its constitution knows as an established fact that the prerogative of making treaties exists in the Crown in its utmost plenitude, and that the compacts entered into by the royal authority have the most complete legal validity and perfection, independent of any other sanction. The Parliament, it is true, is sometimes seen employing itself in altering the existing laws to conform them to the stipulation in a new treaty, and this may have possibly given birth to the imagination that its cooperation was necessary to the obligatory efficacy of the treaty. But this parliamentary interposition proceeds from a different cause, from the necessity of adjusting a most artificial and intricate system of revenue and commercial laws to the changes made in them by the operations of the treaty, and of adapting new provisions and precautions to the new state of things to keep the machine from running into disorder. In this respect, therefore, there is no comparison between the intended power of the President and the actual power of the British sovereign. The one can perform alone what the other can do only with the concurrence of a branch of the legislature. It must be admitted that in this instance, the power of the federal executive would exceed that of any state executive. But this arises naturally from the sovereign power which relates to treaties. If the Confederacy were to be dissolved, it would become a question whether the executives of several states were not solely invested with that delicate and important prerogative. He says this is the only part that maybe the power of the President does not necessarily reflect the powers of different governors. It goes a little step above that. But it makes sense when you're making treaties with different countries. This is important stuff. So you have to give the President the authority to maybe come up with a treaty with others when, if you remember in the past Federalists, we said it's important. Time is of extreme importance. So you don't want to tie the President's hands. You give him the authority to go forward, especially when he finds something that's going to be advantageous to the United States. He makes a treaty with other nations, but then, unlike the King of Britain, it has to be approved by the Senate. 2/3 of the Senate present concur. So he doesn't have the absolute power like the King of Britain has had most of the time. Now here he's referring to, as you remembered, he referred to Blackstone and saying that the King of Britain has absolute power when he makes treaties. But like I said in part one of this Federalist, according to historian J.R. Pohl, he says that he's exaggerating about some of these things, because he says Parliament in the 18th century had kind of was involved in directly or indirectly was involved in treaty making. So king, it wasn't like the king had the absolute authority. So the next paragraph, that's paragraph 8, the president is also to be authorized to receive ambassadors and other public ministers. Now here's one thing that the Anti-Federalists were again criticizing the Constitution. They're saying, well, ambassadors are sent and received only by kings. Why do you guys have in this Constitution that the president is going to receive and send ambassadors? They had a problem with the term because they said that just implies that he has the authority of the king. And Hamilton again says, no, this is wrong. This is a wrong way of looking at it. This, though it has been a rich theme of declamation, is more a matter of dignity than of authority. It is a circumstance which will be without consequence in the administration of the government, and it was far more convenient that it should be arranged in this manner than that there should be a necessity of convening the legislature or one of its branches upon every arrival of a foreign minister, though it were merely to take the place of a departed predecessor. So he says that makes sense for the president to receive ambassadors. It's not because he's a royal authority, he wants to act like it, but it's if you were to get the legislature to receive the royal authority every time, you know what kind of a hassle that would be? Especially if they were back home and with the transportation system that was available back then, with the communication system. He says that just doesn't make sense. It would drive everybody crazy for somebody to get on a wagon, come up here, takes them 10, 12, 14 days just to come in and receive an ambassador from a small country. The ambassador can wait or can just directly be received by the president. And this is paragraph 9. It's going to be a long one, relatively speaking. The president is to nominate, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to appoint ambassadors and other public ministers, judges of the Supreme Court, and in general all officers of the United States established by law and whose appointments are not otherwise provided for by the Constitution. Remember, we talked about part of this when we were talking about senators and their powers and the fact that they were to give advice and consent to the executive in the appointments of ambassadors and making treaties, and very importantly of appointing of the Supreme Court justices. That's the part that he says the president and the Senate work hand in hand, and whose appointments are not otherwise provided for by the Constitution. The King of Great Britain is emphatically and truly styled the fountain of honor. He not only appoints to all offices, but can create offices. So remember, he's constantly saying, well, we can only do certain things. The president can only do certain things with the approval and consent of the Senate, or with the approval or usually with the approval and consent of the Senate, but his authority is limited. But he constantly brings up the King of Britain, whereas the King of Britain can do many things, and these anti-federalists are wrong to compare our president with the King of Britain. There is evidently a great inferiority in the power of the president, in this particular, to that of the British king. nor is it equal to that of the governor of New York if we are to interpret the meaning of the Constitution of the state by the practice which has obtained under it. The power of appointment is with us lodged in a council composed of the governor and 4 members of the Senate. This is talking about the power of appointment in the state of New York. Let me read that again. The power of appointment is with us lodged in a council composed of the governor and 4 members of the Senate chosen by the Assembly. The governor claims and has frequently exercised the right of nomination and is entitled to a casting vote in the appointment. If he really has the right of nominating, his authority in this respect equal to that of the president and exceeds it in the article of the casting vote. In the national government, if the Senate should be divided, no appointment could be made. And in the government of New York, if the council should be divided, the governor can turn the scale and confirm his own nomination. So he actually gives us a footnote, and let me read that footnote. Candor, however, demands an acknowledgement that I do not think the claim of the governor to a right of nomination well-founded. Yet it is always justifiable to reason from the practice of a government till its propriety has been constitutionally questioned. And independent of this claim, when we take into view the other considerations and pursue them through all their consequences, we shall be inclined to draw much the same conclusion. So some aspects, our governor here in the state of New York, Hamilton is saying, is somehow has even got more authority than the President of the United States relatively has in the federal government.